All right, I think I might go ahead and get started. It is 1:02 Eastern time where I am. So I just want to say a big hello to everyone. My name is Tess Greinock, and I'm here today with Negin Agassi-Bake, and we are two of the Visualizing the Future Fellows. And thank you so much for joining our Viz and Tell today as we do a trial run of our Ethics in Data Visualization module. So as part of today's session, we are seeking your feedback on this module. So please feel free to add your feedback to the feedback document, and Negin will post that link in the chat again. And feel free to add your feedback throughout the session. And if you wish to provide feedback at the end or anonymously, we will also be sending out a survey after today's session. And there's also a link to that survey in that Google Doc as well. Just to give you an overview of the module itself, the full module contains a lecture portion with slides and 2 activities, one shorter and one longer activity. And both activities could be done as a full class or small groups, but in the interest of sticking to our 1-hour time limit for today's session, we'll be going through the first activity as you would teach it and participate in it. But for the second activity, we're just going to walk through it and give you an overview of what it's about and how it would work, but not actually do the activity. And then for the last 5 minutes or so of our session today, we're going to give a brief behind the scenes look at the tools we've provided for instructors as part of the module. And hopefully we'll have about 5-10 minutes for questions at the end. So feel free as we're going through the session today to post your questions in the chat, or in that Google Documents, we do have a questions section. And if they're posted in the chat, we will move the questions over there. So just so we can keep track of them. So without further ado, let us move into the module. So to get us thinking about data visualization ethics, I invite you to spend the next minute thinking about one of the following questions. What has made a problematic chart for you in the past? When you have seen a problematic chart, what has been the problem? What are some past problems you've seen in chart? And what has a chart made you question? When has the chart made you question its validity? And if you can't think of a problematic chart, how did you learn about a problematic design technique? And if you feel comfortable, please add your response to the Google Doc. And we're just going to spend about a minute or two with this reflection. Yeah, so I'm seeing some great responses coming through in the chat here from the trying to cram too many data variables into a clustered bar chart, the wrong display, misleading axes, varying scales across multiple graphs. Yeah. All right. So now that you're sort of in that frame of mind with these things that we should be looking for when we're viewing charts, let's get into what we're going to be covering today. So the schedule for today's session is that we're going to be spending the first 15 to 20 minutes in a lecture outlining the ethical implications throughout the data visualization process. And then we're going to move into our first activity, which is going to be in small groups for this session. It's going to be about 15 to 20 minutes there. And then we'll do the second activity walkthrough for 5 to 10 minutes. And then the behind the scenes for instructors and wrap up for 5 minutes. And then with 10 minutes for questions, hopefully. And at the end of the day's session, we hope that you'll be able to list the 5 steps in the data visualization creation process, select the topic or problem or question, acquire data, clean data, analyze data, and create the visualization, and understand how these decisions in the steps up to the data visualization can affect the final visualization, and then identify common sources of bias in the data visualization process and practice ethics-centered data visualization design. So let's begin with some definitions. The good old dictionary definition of ethics is a set of moral principles, especially ones relating to or affirming a specified group, field, or form of conduct. And as this definition suggests, ethics are not fixed and must often be negotiated as we balance the multiple groups we are members of. And there's no one right way to do data visualization, but there are several wrong ways. Most importantly, the decisions leading up to the final visualization should be made intentionally as opposed to accidentally, and hopefully they're ethically informed. So ethical data visualization starts with the data and the recognition that data is not neutral. It's affected by all the decisions made through the data's lifecycle, from its collection to its visualization and publication. So we're going to start our journey right at the very beginning with topic selection. For each step in the process, we're going to go through a series of questions you should ask yourself, whether you're performing that step in the data process or received or find the data elsewhere. And then we'll follow up with an example of bias that can occur at the step in the process. So when selecting a topic, problem, or question, you should ask yourself, why is this study being done? Does it contribute to new understanding or possible change? Who benefits from the study? Who might be harmed? Is there a possible conflict of interest? Will the study exclude participants who may have benefited from being included in the study? Are the participants protected? Is the population overburdened by research? And am I the right person to do this research? What knowledge gaps do I have? And have I built trust with the community that I'm researching or that I'm going to be researching with? And if appropriate, have I pre-registered my research? And during this study topic selection process, there is a potential for exclusion because of the research scope, such as focusing a study of heart attack symptoms on symptoms that are more common for men, like chest pain, or focusing a study of child cereal preferences on healthy cereals, but not accounting for nut allergies, or focusing a study of library satisfaction on physical spaces in the library and ignoring distance students. The next step in the data process is acquiring the data itself, whether it's original data being collected or reusing data already available. And it's important to ask ourselves, what choices were made about collection method, participant selection, questions included, et cetera, and what influenced those choices? Are the people represented in the data being treated with dignity? Have they been included in the decision-making process? Are you minimizing the burden and risk placed on them? And will the data you have answer your research question? Are you collecting more data than you need or not enough? What are you consciously not collecting and why? And have you cited the source of any secondary data? And the same questions above apply to secondary data as well, including who collected the data and how was it collected and in what context. And during the data collection process, bias can be introduced by taking shortcuts. Some common shortcuts that we've seen in research include conducting psychology experiments only with students enrolled in an introductory psychology courses. This ignores the bias that is introduced in the population, including age, gender, educational background, and race, ethnicity, et cetera. And this is commonly labeled availability bias. Another example is participant exclusion because focus group is held in the evening when non-traditional students might have caretaking responsibilities, or a similar exclusion by advertising the study only on certain listservs, or exploring community dynamics on Twitter, but only looking at public tweets. And now Nagin is going to take us through the rest of the steps.
Thanks, Tess, and sorry in advance if I have to pause to sneeze because my allergies have been a little bananas today, so we'll hope for the best. So there are also questions to think through when you're cleaning the data. Some of these questions are, what data has been normalized in the data cleaning process, what assumptions have been made, and what's been left out. So how are the outliers handled, and how can that data be maintained or represented in some way? Are the people who are contributing their data being represented in a way that's authentic to them, even after the cleaning process? And also, a lot of times we're not cleaning the data ourselves. So if you didn't clean the data yourself, who do you need to give credit for cleaning the data? But also, can you read through their documentation of how they clean their data? Throughout the collection and cleaning process, there are also some complications that might arise due to data aggregation. For example, survey respondents from underrepresented minorities are often grouped together to avoid identification, but this decision also leads to the erasure of some groups. Another example is students with low GPAs that are grouped together in a category, for example, below 3.5, even though over 85% of students in that category have a GPA of over 2.5 or under 2.5. Choosing a large bin size is another example when looking at poverty across counties in a state, which hides an important bimodal pattern. But of course, there's always a balancing issue with data aggregation, right? You want to represent people, but you also don't want to identify them. There's not a solution. If anyone does have a solution, please share it with us. But it's just important to be aware of these problems as you're going throughout the process. And maybe it's just a sign that you might need to run a different study and make sure that the population you're working with is both well protected and also well represented. When you're analyzing there are questions that come up in that part of the process that can help guide you in terms of centering ethics as well. So some of those questions are you applying the best method, and what is the best method, and who says it's the best method? Are you fully exploring the data, and do you know enough about it to interpret the results? How are you sharing the limitations of your analysis, and how are you recognizing the labor of anyone else who helped with or did the analysis, and really being transparent about that process? And these are just a few questions that can be helpful to reflect on and take action on as you're working through the analysis portion. But of course, through the analysis process, there are also opportunities for bias to be introduced by some assumptions you might have made. For example, you may have misunderstood a hashtag that was meant to be sarcastic and coded a series of tweets as having positive sentiment instead of negative sentiment. Or you might have ignored gender because you didn't expect that it would be an issue, but then later realized that there are issues with sexual harassment in that population. Or maybe you saw a drop in counts as a problem with data collection process when actually there was a big pandemic that year. All of these questions you're asking and decisions you're making should be accounted for in your final visualization, and it can really help to document your process in order to be transparent in your decision making. If you've relied on the labor of anyone else, give credit to that person or to that organization, and fill in any gaps in your own knowledge by consulting literature and work put out by members of the community being visualized, especially if you're not a part of that community. And as you're visualizing, there's some questions you can ask yourself to help guide more ethical decisions. So, for example, what elements are you emphasizing? And how do those elements impact the tone of the visualization? What values are you centering in your visualization? And what worldview are you setting up? The answers to these questions have ethical implications and are important to think through throughout the visualization process. And it's also helpful to know your audience, and this doesn't just mean the needs of different stakeholders, though of course that's always a part of it, but it's also to think about who your intended and unintended audiences are, and the historical context in which your audiences and your visualizations work in. People can feel recognized, misrecognized, and unrecognized in data visualizations for a number of reasons. This can help think through how to maximize benefits and minimize harm as much as possible, and also fill in any necessary gaps in the narrative. It also helps to consider who will use the visualization and why, and will anyone's privacy be violated if you create and share this visualization, and also if there are any bad actors, if there's anyone who would misuse the visualization. It can also help to think through how to promote empathy for those who are present in your data by respecting the people represented in it as whole individuals instead of data points. So I know I've seen a lot of COVID-19 death rate stats and visualizations, and you might have noticed that some do a much better job than others at recognizing the people behind the data points. And finally, does the visualization empower your audience? It's one thing to visualize something that reflects a particular issue, and it's a whole other thing to actually empower readers of your visualization to do something about it. These two visualizations are ones that you might have seen already. They've been going around for a while. It's the Magic Bean Shop and the Fries That Bind Us. They serve as a good example of how certain visualization decisions can be misleading or non inclusive. For example, the differences between country colors are almost entirely invisible, and the arrows are really unclear, hard to follow, and the contrast is probably too low. The colors chosen may also exclude certain groups of color blindness. The circles cover up the map and are not proportionate. The legend suggests that data were binned, so the size isn't continuous, and the circle area doesn't seem to represent the values very well. The size of the logos, though super fun, are also not proportionate, and that distorts the data by changing both the width and the length uh, of the visuals of the logos instead of just length like a bar chart. And the 3D chart at the bottom makes the data harder to read, and it also distorts the data by changing volume instead of just length. Not all parts of the summaries are also clearly supported by the data. If it might be hard to read on the slide, but if you do get a chance to read a little more closely, it not necessarily direct correlation with the data there. So I'm sure there are a lot of other critiques that you can make on this, but these are just a few examples of how in these visualizations, there are some decisions that were made that didn't center inclusivity and ethics. So we're going to switch over to small groups now. And if you don't want to participate, you are welcome to either come back to the main room or not participate in your breakout room. And just please feel free to participate in whatever capacity works best for you, camera off, mic off, whatever works if you want to just do chat. But the question you'll be discussing or reflecting on alone is, what is one strategy you will or already do use to center ethics in the data visualization process? And as a reminder, please capture thoughts that you feel comfortable sharing as they come up in the Google Doc, which Tess has helpfully thank you, Tess, just shared in the chat, whether it's about the reflection question itself or about the activity. And we'll spend about 5 minutes or so in these rooms. So Angela's gonna take it away and create those breakout rooms for us. All right, so I think we should all be back now. I hope that was useful. Thank you all for participating and engaging. I saw some good stuff in the reflection, so about agency and how to relate nulls or nothings. So that's all great. Thanks for those conversations. And we're actually going to switch over to an activity now. So you'll be split up into groups of about 5 or 6, and we'll be looking at the income below poverty by county maps in Mississippi. For some context, we want to understand the relationship between gender and poverty in Mississippi by county. So everything I'm going to say, the questions will be in that document again, in case you missed it in the chat. So don't worry about memorizing this or writing all this down. So each group will answer these questions. What conclusions would you draw about any effect of gender on poverty levels in Mississippi? Are there any misleading components of the maps? Is there any information that is missing that would be necessary for interpreting these maps? You don't have to answer all of them. Just start with one that's interesting to you and your group and work through as many as you can. And again, questions are available in the Google Doc along with close-ups of the map so you don't have to rely on the small ones on the slide. Again, please feel free to participate in whatever way feels comfortable to you. You can also return to the main room if you'd prefer and take a break. We'll spend 10 minutes or so on this activity, and this time we'll be in groups of about 5 to 6, so shaking it up a little bit. Angela, if you wouldn't mind setting those up again, please. Okay, so I think we should all be back. Thank you all again for participating in the activity. I didn't notice any comments in the document, but some of the things you might have talked about um, were what might have been, the distribution across the county seems very similar for men and women, um, with women experiencing higher level of poverty overall and in some specific counties. The maps and the note are missing specifics about the source of data. Is it the decennial census, the American Community Survey, from what year? And it's missing some, pretty typical elements. So it's missing a north arrow, a scale bar, a label identifying the state as Mississippi. For context, we might also want to know the general population density for each county. And also the data classification method that they use results in different scales for each map, making it a lot harder to make direct comparisons across groups. So as you might have noticed by doing this activity, there's a bit of a challenge with census data. It's usually stratified by one demographic variable, such as race or gender. But it's important to remember Kimberly Crenshaw's theory of intersectionality, which is about the social construction of multiple identities as overlapping systems of discrimination. And this map of the distribution of African American people across the US by county, consider again its one-dimensional representation, but also note that there's a high concentration of African Americans in Mississippi, which is not well represented in the earlier maps, which we might want to consider. It's also important to challenge our assumptions when reading and creating data visualizations. So, for example, did we know enough about the history of Mississippi to be able to interpret the relationship between poverty and gender? Should the map creators have investigated the intersection of race and gender as it relates to poverty in Mississippi? Who benefits from this work? And does it empower people, especially the communities involved, to actually continue to build power? So, looking at poverty stratified by both race and gender, what do these visualizations reveal? Which group is most affected by poverty across Mississippi? And if we're taking an intersectional approach, looking at poverty by both race and gender, it reveals that Black women are most affected by poverty across Mississippi. It highlights the limitations of exploring gender without race. Black men face higher rates of poverty than white women, but this would be rendered invisible if we aggregated that with data on white men. And the power granted to maps and data, which in many cases can and has led to the reinforcement of oppressive structures, is also the reason why they have potential to be used to bring attention to those oppressive structures. So thanks again for engaging in this. I'm going to hand it back to Tess now to talk about what the second activity for this workshop would be if we were to do it.
Yes, thanks, Nagin. So although won't be doing it today, we wanted to walk you through the second longer activity we have to accompany this module, which we've drafted as another group activity, but it could be done as a whole class. So in this activity, each group would receive a copy of an original chart from the Economist Medium article titled "Mistakes We've Drawn a Few," such as the example provided on the right. And each group would answer the following questions about the chart. What message is the chart trying to get across? What is misleading about this chart or preventing the message from getting across? And with the above questions in mind, how would you redesign the chart? And then ask them to sketch out or use their preferred visualization software to redesign the chart. This is also a great place as if you are teaching a particular software or using it for particular software for a whole course, that they could use that software in this example. In this activity. And then bringing the groups back together to share redesigns and discuss. And for the discussions, we recommend showing the solutions that the economists came up with. So for the example we were just showing, the message the chart is trying to get across, or one that might come up in the discussions, is how far Jeremy Corbyn surpasses other British political parties and candidates in the number of Facebook likes. And what is misleading about this chart or preventing the message from getting across? The Economist article indicated that it was the truncated scale. And then we also talked about and there's room for discussion about other improvements that the Economist made to their new chart, which is on the right, or what they call the better chart, which is they moved to a single color for the bars as well. But something that they also changed that might be slightly confusing is the thousands notation that they use in their better chart. And so these are just areas for possible discussion. And maybe if you were working with an audience more similar to economists, that the thousands notations would not be a complication, but maybe it adds to the chart. And that's something to talk about. Different audiences might need something different. So the same article has several other charts, and this activity could work for any chart that has undergone a makeover. But I just wanted to go over the ones that were in the Medium article. So there's one comparing dog neck size to weight, remorse over Brexit, the trade deficit and manufacturing employment, and then GDP and population, government spending, pension benefits as a percentage of GDP, and population over 65. And then also looking at surpluses in the EU. And then these are just all the references for everything that we have in the module. And before we get to questions, I just wanted to take a moment to give you a behind the scenes tour of what we have available for instructors. And I'm going to go and yes, we can share the slides. I'm just going to start from the back to show you sort of what we have for instructors. So for example, we started collecting alternate examples for the second activity where you are comparing two different charts. We also, for each of these in the activities, we've provided possible answers and perhaps areas for further discussion, as well as for the second activity. Some of these charts are getting that message or finding that problematic issue or with the chart, or what's preventing the message from getting across is some are harder to find or understand than others. So we've tried to indicate that in the notes as well, just so that you can tailor it to your audience. And then we've also provided instructions for the activities for instructors as well. So there was a slide that can be shown to the class, but also for instructors that just give a little bit more explanation. And then on each of these slides as well, we have, if you go back into our lecture portion, we have extra questions listed below, as well as sources as well. So you'll see in this one here that we've listed the sources for where we've gotten some of our questions and our thoughts from. And then we've also provided an ideal schedule, which I mentioned earlier, and as well as a general instructions guide for the module. And also all of these slides were left plain intentionally, so feel free to dress them up as you would like. All right, and that brings us to the end of today's session. And are there any questions? And feel free to put your question in the chat or in the Google document, or just unmute yourself and ask away. So there's a question about what audience are you envisioning, undergraduate, graduates, or others? So we're hoping that this module will be flexible enough that it could be tailored to any audience. That is our ultimate goal anyways. So if you were doing this example, with undergraduates, for example, maybe there would be, you would include less questions for things like registering the research, or things like that to still get across the important questions, but maybe not go into it as much depth. And then for the activities, choosing, as I mentioned earlier, maybe some of the easier charts, and then, or switching them out for maybe more topic-based ones. So if it's undergraduates in a specific field, such as biology, maybe you find biology-based charts. Yeah. Sorry, Terrence, which charts? The ones from the...
Sorry, yeah, I was referring to the Mississippi charts.
Oh, okay.
I had a general question. So how are the Mississippi charts made? And this is kind of a general question, but especially for undergraduates, what tool do you start with?
All right. Alyssa has provided this lovely example for us. I'm not sure if is she still on the call? Yes.
I'm here. Yes, I can answer that question. So actually we designed a data portal. This was a project that I worked on with an organization in Mississippi that wanted to have a data portal that would display census data related to Mississippi, and that, if folks could sort of like toggle between different topics. So they're custom, but they're built with like D3 in JavaScript, basically. If we were doing this in a class, I would say like the tool I would start with to make like a nice looking, I mean, even Social Explorer, if you have a license, you can do these kinds of maps of census data. I would not use the Census Data Explorer. I hate their tool. That's just a personal preference. And then QGIS has some really, if you're like artistic or into like visual aesthetics, like I think QGIS as a desktop application has nicer looking maps than most. But I normally do Social Explorer if I want my students to like create these themselves.
Yeah, another tool that I've used is Policy Map, and they have a free version as well as a institutional subscription version, which I've used both.
I've been slow to trying out Data Wrapper, and I don't know about their mapping capabilities, but if you are looking for a tool that I think would be really accessible to undergraduates, that might be something to think about for basic charts at the very least, and maybe also for mapping.
I also really like raw graphs for intro, like undergrad level, because again, it's in browser and they do a great job of like showing what kinds of variables are needed for certain kinds of charts, or sort of data types essentially are needed for certain types of charts, which is just really useful.
Yeah, I think I'll second Angela's recommendation for Data Wrapper, partly because it's meant for journalists. They do forefront things like what are the sources of your data, what, giving credit for things. The mapping I find a little harder to do than the regular charts, but I think they do push you towards some good practices with what they have built into the interface.
Anne says, sorry if someone's already read this out, Simply Analytics is also great for mapping, but it's a subscription service.
All right, we have a question. I realize the topics about ethics and best practices can overlap quite a bit. Can you talk a bit about this? And I think there are a lot of workshops and content that talk about data visualization best practices, but maybe less so worded and focus on ethics, maybe? I don't know, Nagina, if you want to take a stab at this first. I see you nodding your head.
Oh, sorry. I'm like nodding to like, yep, I'm listening, but I'm also nodding because I've thought a lot about this question too, and it's a good one. And I think there are some data visualization best practices that personally I feel like are almost like contradictory to some ethical best practices. The biggest one I'm thinking about is like, the more white space the better, or like, just clean it up, super minimal, which is like a lot of times really not useful for people who are using screen readers, for example, right? Like actually the more text and the more context that is on the visualization, the better, because then it can be translated through a screen reader, right? So there's certainly points of tension, and there's definitely overlap as well with certain practices, but overall, I think whichever decision you make for a visualization can come from, either set of best practices, as long as it's sort of, what's the goal what's the goal of your visualization, and sort of like, what value are you upholding in this visualization? Like what is your audience as well? Who's going to be using it? So all those things kind of come together. Sorry, it's not like a full, complete answer. It's not an easy solution, I guess, but there's certainly points of tension as well that I think and I'm interested in those points of tension personally, but yeah, like there's just those guiding questions again that can combine with best practices, and just, if they happen to overlap, great. And if they don't, then it's just an area to think about a little bit more.
I just one aspect of that question, I love that question, is a lot of the stuff I've seen that talks about ethic data visualization assumes like an interpretation perspective. Not all of it, but I would say the majority of it is about interpreting and making sense of data visualizations, et cetera. And so it is interesting to try to best practice in the sense of like how you use these to actually make these and do the work. And so I think the workshop bridges that in a way that it speaks to both of those kind of use cases of like interpretation, and also, as we've discussed, making it using tools. But I'm curious how people see this type of resource if there's a need to clarify those things or how well it suits those use cases, because they're not exactly the same in practice necessarily, but there's obviously a lot of overlap as the question mentions.
Any other questions? I'm just going to put a link to our feedback survey, and we would encourage, if even if you don't have any other feedback for us, that please complete the survey. It does contain some questions that we do require to fill out for the IMLS grant. So we greatly appreciate if nothing else, if you fill out the 4 multiple choice questions, and then if you would like to provide feedback, there's a free text box on the bottom.
I guess I was curious about the first activity with the maps.
Mm-hmm.
What's the intention to get feedback on? Because as I was looking at the questions, it seemed more about answering information questions about poverty or things like that. And of course, with what you're talking about with ethics and what you go into later, it's bringing out problematic aspects of the representation itself and what data is being shown and all these things. Do you intend that in that first activity, people are going to come up with what they think are problems with the visualization? I felt kind of stuck, like I had problems with the visualization, but I'm a practitioner, but I didn't see that in your questions, like a place to put, if you feel like there are problems and you're having trouble answering these questions because of the representation, what's getting in your way or something, or is that giving away too much? Or I don't know. So I was curious about the motivation and what you expected out of the audience.
Yeah, I think, yeah, the hope was that there would be, especially like if the groups were able to get, or individuals were able to get to the sort of the second 2 questions, that are there any misleading components to this map, and information missing, that was sort of like the leading to hopefully the idea that, oh, this is Mississippi, what are there other factors other than just gender that might have an effect on poverty that we're not taking into account? And Alyssa, you can speak to, has your previous experience using this activity before, but or hopefully that maybe if they didn't get that they were missing, that there was another sort of missing variable that they weren't taking into account, that when we come to it later, it'll be like an aha moment for that. And Alyssa, if you wanted to.
Yeah, so yeah, I can quickly say that. So when we develop, I mean, this comes from a real project, but we sort of realized this when we were working with students that, like, you know, we were trying to design a way to like assess proficiency with like reading and consuming like map visualizations in particular. And then like get students to understand like what kind of biases go into like making maps, and not necessarily just with the data, but with like what you put on the map and what you don't put on the map, and whether people need proficiency or not. So the idea with this basic one is sort of to get students, the target audience is undergraduates in this case, or folks who are less familiar with spatial visualizations, to get to like a sort of like very low bar proficiency of saying, well, if I don't, like, just seeing like that the distributions are different on both maps, and just wondering like why, and like, do I need to know more information about that in order to interpret this? People have a tendency to want to compare when maps are side by side, but you actually can't compare maps that have different breakdowns, or it's much more difficult. And so I think that, you know, students don't necessarily always come up with these, but when they look at it, they like, the longer they look at it, they start to realize, I don't actually know what year this data is from. If I actually saw this on like a website, like what's the point of someone like showing these side by side? Like, what are they trying to get? What would they want me to get out of it? Why wouldn't they put the year that this is from? Why wouldn't they put the data source? I'm assuming it's ACS because it says that, but it doesn't say if it's 5-year estimates, 3-year, 1 year, whatever. So part of this is also, you know, contingent on students knowing a little bit about how census data works. So that's also can be sort of a precursor. But I would say it's basic things of like, do you know where Mississippi is? Do you know what Mississippi looks like? And if you don't, is this going to be something that you like, that you understand just from these maps? And then why would someone create these visualizations without that information? Like, is it malicious or is it just laziness? You know, so it's like sort of like getting people to ask those kinds of questions at a basic level. And then you move on and say, like, you do need to know a lot about a subject to interpret like, you know, this kind of map, because if you don't know the history of like the demographic distributions in Mississippi, this is like less meaningful than if you are aware of that. That makes sense.
Cool. Thank you.
And you know, the implication being that it's easy for a map maker to hide that by choosing not to visualize those things, if that makes sense.
And I just wanted to point out a couple of comments in the chat as well, with Megan saying that I think much of the tensions come from various types of exclusions, whether about the audience or about earlier in the process. Terrence says that I like how the presentation emphasized how ethics are community derived and changing. Seems like an invitation to have students in classes create or decide their own data ethics. So that's a really great idea as well. And I've actually tried that once. It was a super great conversation. So I recommend testing that too.
All right, and we have come to the top of the hour. So I just want to quick thank you to everybody for joining us today. And Nagin has posted the links to our survey and our feedback and questions document again in the chat. Thank you so much. And I had a little bit I was supposed to say at the end here. Make sure I say everything. Wait, yes, we're going to have the recording and summary of today up soon, and we're going to send that out as a very brief email via the listserv. And we are going to have our information and registration for the next Viz and Tell as well, hopefully at that time. And in the meantime, please feel free to continue these conversations through our Slack and reach out to us with any questions or comments. Thanks, everyone.